Okay, this is another episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft, the weekly vodcast podcast with myself and Rob Staten as we talk about the NFL draft as well as college football and how it relates specifically to the draft as well as the NFL and how it related to last year's draft and so on and so forth as we try and figure out what happens between the beginning of the college football season and the draft and how names and dates and people change so much over that period of time. Rob Staten writes for SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Myself, Kenneth Arthur, writes for FieldGoals.com. And our guest today, Dan Kadar from Mocking the Draft. Is it officially still MockingTheDraft.com or is it SBNation.com/MockingTheDraft?
I think if I tell people to go to MockingTheDraft.com, it goes to the right URL still, which is something like SBNation.com/NFL-mock-draft, which gets that hot mock draft traffic. So I put my stuff up there, and as we get closer to the draft, it'll be over at SBNation.com/NFL-draft.
Perfect. Who doesn't like a good URL with some hyphens and as many slashes and such as possible? Dan, just to get a little bit of backstory, can you explain, what drew you specifically to the draft and mock drafts specifically? Like, when did you start? How many mock drafts have you done over the years? If you could take a guess.
Well, if I had to take a guess, I mean, I don't know, 600 or 700 probably, because I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, unfortunately, and being a Cleveland Browns fan, the draft is what you typically have to look forward to. So,
indeed,
quite a long time ago, I started writing about the NFL draft, probably in 2004, 2003, sometime around then, and it was good fun. I was on a site with Matt Miller of Bleacher Report and Matt Brown of Sports on Earth, who you guys have had on, and some other really great guys. And we had a site, and we all kind of went our separate ways. I landed at SB Nation, and that was for the 2009 draft. So it's been good fun. Do a lot of fun stuff. We go to the Combine every year, the Senior Bowl every year. So it's great.
Yeah, and it's important to have fun with something else in relation to football when you're rooting for the Browns. There's no doubt about that. So just beginning, every week we start out with Twin Calf, which stands for This Week in NCAA Football. And this week in NCAA football, there were 4 top 10 teams that lost. Probably the biggest one, obviously, Ole Miss, number 3, losing to Florida right there at the bottom of the top 25. Me and Rob, we talked a lot about Florida last week, and they played Tennessee and beat them, and we thought this is a Florida team that has a lot of talented players. Dan, can you sort of talk about what you see in Florida? Like, who are some of your favorite players on the Gators, and how good do you think that they really are?
Well, obviously, it starts with Vernon Hargreaves, the cornerback. I mean, to me, he's the best cornerback in the draft. I have him rated as the number 3 overall player. So he's a very, very good player, that true classic number 1 shutdown cornerback type of guy. So he's very good. Jonathan Bullard, the defensive lineman, is very good. Antonio Morrison, who's a linebacker there, is pretty solid. And on offense, I think that's where you don't find as many NFL draft eligible prospects right now, at least to me. And that's why I kind of question how long they're going to be able to make this run go. I mean, I love Jim McElwain, the coach there, but they just don't have a lot of high-end talent on offense, I don't think. I mean, they've got a couple good wide receivers. Robinson's probably the best one. He's draft eligible. So some good players on defense, not as much on offense.
Rob, do you want to jump in and say anything about Vernon Hargreaves?
Well, it's the wonderful thing about the NFL draft is with anything with the NFL is that it's all about opinions, and I'm not a huge Vernon Hargreaves fan. I've seen him a few times and spent a bit of time looking at him because I kind of feel like the Seahawks they're maybe not going to take a cornerback in the first round, but they're going to look at these guys. And I just feel that eventually in the process, Vernon Hargreaves is going to get found out a little bit. And whether that's at the Combine or whether it's people sort of judging his tape and the erraticism in his game sometimes. I mean, against Tennessee, just missed tackle after missed tackle in the open field. And I think that eventually teams are going to find enough holes to sort of push him down a little bit. There are one or two other cornerbacks that I just prefer that I don't think get anywhere near as much attention. You know, we may well talk about someone like Cameron Sutton today and stuff like that, and Will Redmond at Mississippi State, who for me just deserve a little bit more of a push. But, you know, I think it's really great, Kenny, that Florida are doing what they're doing. You know, we predicted a few weeks ago that while Ole Miss have got an immense amount of talent on their team, that ultimately they will come up against an opponent down the line who will just find a way to really dominate them, and it seems to happen every year under Hugh Freeze, and this was it. It was Florida. You know, they have a very average quarterback, but Jim McElwain, for me, is a really good coach, and I think it's great to see Florida prospering under him. I think he's got a really good chance of doing some special things with that team over the years when he gets his own guys in there. So good to see for Florida, but kind of inevitable that Ole Miss were going to have a game like this.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Ole Miss, we're going to get into mock drafts here. Dan, when is your first post for mid-season or whatever, in-season mock draft? When officially is that going out?
Yeah, I can't say when officially. Sometime this week, though. I mean, I have to turn it in tonight, and we'll see when we find a good publishing window. So it could be as early as Tuesday morning. It could be a little later in the week. So sometime this week.
So it's fun for me this week because I'm not the guy that's making the mock drafts, but Rob does and you do. And it's fun for me this week because I get to see both of the worlds, and maybe I'll be the one to clash the heads. Okay, guys? So just feel free to go after each other.
But can I just say that it's great to have Dan on tonight because it seems a little strange now because the world has gone so much with social media and stuff like that. But around sort of 2007, 2008, when Twitter wasn't really a thing, blogs were the big thing, and Dan is kind of a pioneer when it comes to writing and talking about the draft. Was the go-to site for NFL draft information or a place to go and really talk about the draft with other NFL fans. And let's not forget that back in 2007, 2008, 2009, the Seahawks were kind of similar to the Browns, and they were picking early in the draft. So we needed something else to talk about as well as Seahawks fans. So I think it's great. I think Dan, for the time that he has done it, and for kind of leading the way and probably inspiring many, many other draft blogs, mine included. You know, I think a tip of the cap to Dan, really, while we've got him on here tonight.
Absolutely, and one of the biggest trends I think as well, and we got to see Dan's mock draft, and we can talk about it. But one of the biggest trends, obviously, even though Ole Miss loses this week, you know, in the beginning of the year it was like how many guys from Ohio State are going to go in the top 10 or in the first round, and now looking at Dan's mock draft, it's a lot of Ole Miss guys who got 3 of the top 7 that went to Ole Miss. Including your Cleveland Browns taking Laquan Treadwell, the wide receiver at Ole Miss. Is that your dream pick, or is that what you see the Browns doing?
I think it's the most logical choice. And Rob, thanks very much for the kind words. That means a lot. But Laquan Treadwell to the Browns, I think, would obviously mean that Ray Farmer probably isn't the general manager there anymore, because I don't think he's ever going to take a wide receiver that high in the draft. And by the way, my draft order is based on Super Bowl odds heading into last week of the NFL season. So I just think the Browns offense, they just so clearly need a threat at wide receiver, quite frankly, any offensive skill position. And, you know, wide receiver, Treadwell, I have him as the number 1 guy right now, and he's just a really physical wide receiver. He can really go up and get the ball. He might be a 4.5 guy, but I think that's okay. He's so talented. So from a logic standpoint, I think it makes sense for the Browns to take a wide receiver that high, but if they do, it means they've got a new general manager. So, you know, classic Cleveland, I guess.
Rob, do you see? Obviously, you've got Laquan Treadwell at number 8 in your big board sort of kind of deal, but you see him maybe. Obviously, anybody at 8 could jump up to 3, but could Treadwell be this year's number 3 pick?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, he's a really, really good player. And I think the one issue with him really was to see how he came back from what was a horrendous injury at the end of last year. he's done it. He's improving gradually as time has gone on. He still had a decent game for the weekend despite the defeat. And I think we really saw in the Alabama game, especially in some others, that he looks really sharp. And as Dan says there, it doesn't really matter. He's the kind of guy that if he got to the combine and ran, in the 4.5s, it wouldn't really matter. You can throw him the ball. He's incredibly polished, very athletic, very gritty and competitive. Will get the ball in the air, good size. He's that kind of like number one. He's exactly the kind of player that probably Cleveland lacks right now. That they could fit in there and would help out whoever's going to be the quarterback. But I'd like to know if Dan thinks is a GM change and given the way that Cleveland have been pretty competitive over the last year and now 4 games, is another big change in terms of the staff behind the scenes and with the coaches, is that likely, or would Pettine get another year? I mean, because the team seems to be playing for him. It's just maybe finishing, and given that he hasn't got a franchise quarterback, Johnny Manziel is not that guy, and McCown certainly isn't. Do you think he's going to survive as well?
Well, before the season, Jimmy Haslam said he's not going to clean house, but if you just look at the way the season might play out, if the Browns end up 3-13, it's going to be hard to justify saying Mike Pettine should get another year. I mean, a lot of people around here really like him on a personal level. I know the players have pretty much bought into his system and the whole thing, but at the same time, it's a results-based thing. And if the Browns are bad again, and it's starting to look like it's going to be that way. I mean, they went 1-2 in the easiest part of the schedule there at the beginning of the year. It could get bad. I'm more confident that Mike Pettine will get another year than I am that Ray Farmer will, just because Ray Farmer has the text stuff that he got in trouble for. So that has to factor into it a little bit, I think. But with Pettine, you look at the team; they're last again in the NFL in run defense. They really don't have an identity on offense. His assistant coaches are guys that were kind of his friends. I mean, the offensive coordinator, Mike Pettine's dad, coached him in high school. So you just kind of have to wonder, when you dig a little bit deeper into how the franchise is constructed and what the results are proving out to be, it's kind of hard to find a reason to say he should absolutely get more time in Cleveland.
Speaking of the Browns and Ray Farmer in the draft, last year the Browns had 12 draft picks. It's an opportunity to really fill out the roster, especially it's a roster that there's a lot of players that can go in there and make some damage. In the first 6 picks, you got Danny Shelton, Cam Irving, Nate Orchard, Duke Johnson, Xavier Cooper, and Ibrahim Campbell. And I believe they're all still with the Browns. But then you've got your next 6 picks, and only one of those guys, Malcolm Johnson, appears to still be playing. Is that somewhat discouraging as well? I mean, when you look at the Seahawks rebuild in 2010, 2011, 2012 with John Schneider and Pete Carroll, I mean, it wasn't really the fact that they were hitting in the beginning. It was the fact that they were finding talent after the third day and in undrafted free agencies. So is that a problem? Are they trying to swing too big and not what do you think is the issue there with all these players that were rookies immediately not making the team?
Yeah, well, 2 of them, Ifo Ekpeolamu and Randall Telfair, they drafted them fully knowing that they're not going to play this year. So they're basically on IR. I don't think they're officially on IR, but they're designated, they're not going to be with the team this year, basically. So I think the back half of the draft wasn't as big of an issue as the first part because, last year the Browns took Justin Gilbert. He can't get on the field in the first round. They took Johnny Manziel. They're not putting him in the game. That was a first-round pick. Cam Irving was a first-round pick this year. He plays like 3 snaps a game in special jumbo packages. Danny Shelton's been pretty solid, but the rest of that early part of the draft this year, Ibrahim Campbell never plays. Nate Orchard he's a very spotty player. So it's more so missing on the early picks that look bad. I mean, it would be great if they were all contributing, but that's just not the case. And I think the Justin Gilbert one in particular, it really stands out. I mean, yesterday, for instance, the Chargers literally had two healthy wide receivers left in the game, and Justin Gilbert's still not in the game covering someone. So, the Browns are playing like their special teams ace at cornerback at that point in the game, and that's not a good thing. So, it's really the early picks more than anything that are kind of dooming the Browns.
Yeah, and can I just say that I saw a lot of the game, and when Gilbert was on the field, Philip Rivers was noticing it straight away and was looking for him. And I think the Dan makes a great point there, because when you look at the first round, and it's easy to do it with hindsight, but look what the Browns did. I mean, they moved down in the first round and eventually took Justin Gilbert, who I know a lot of people liked Justin Gilbert, but the warning signs were so there with his time at Oklahoma State, and major character issues and attitude issues, and I didn't think he warranted a first-round pick, and yet it looks like a really strange one now, and it's even more frustrating, Dan, I guess, when you look at who followed. I mean, Odell Beckham was the 12th pick, just 4 picks later. Could the Browns use Odell Beckham right now? Yeah, they could. Aaron Donald is the 13th pick and just looks like a superstar. It looks like Warren Sapp, but a little bit quicker and lighter in there. And then Johnny Manziel, it just isn't playing. And a few picks later, Teddy Bridgewater is starting in Minnesota, and while he's perhaps not having the same success that Russell Wilson had in his first year and a bit, he's winning games and certainly not ruining things in Minnesota. And then Derek Carr has performed well as well. So it's the problem for a Browns fan is that you look at that and you think you could easily have been having Teddy Bridgewater throwing to Odell Beckham, or having Aaron Donald rushing up the middle, and instead you've got Justin Gilbert, who can barely get on the field, and Johnny Manziel, who's not on the field. And then to make matters worse, they absolutely nailed the Joel Bitonio pick, which is it must be very frustrating.
Yeah, you just nailed the essence of why I cover the NFL draft. So, yeah, no, it's exactly true. And, I get like 50 texts from friends on Sundays describing what you just said, but with much more colorful, foul language. So, yeah, it's, I know you can do the what if with every team in regard to the draft, but it sure feels like you can do it with the Browns more than anyone else.
Well, and it's about the fact that, it seems like they follow the same patterns no matter who the GM is. They get 2 picks, and it's going to be the same. It seems to be going the same way. We'll get back to mocking the Browns here in a bit. But just finishing up some more stuff about this week in college football, hitting some of the bigger names and bigger games. Ohio State doesn't really play that well in their win over Indiana, though Ezekiel Elliott, Heisman candidate, does rush for 274 yards and 3 touchdowns. I think that's kind of interesting that he led the country in the nation in rushing this week. Usually it seems like it's going to be some guy in some small school or some guy playing something else that rushes for 300 yards. But Elliott, he led the way this week. We've talked a lot about how this running back class, and especially even beyond the underclassmen, obviously Leonard Fournette, have been so good. We've got your mock draft here, but you want to go into, Dan, how you feel about Ezekiel Elliott, and also why don't you just compare him maybe to Todd Gurley, who we saw finally play and break out this week for the Rams?
Yeah, I think Gurley is he's a little bit of a notch above where Ezekiel Elliott is right now. I think he's a little smoother of a runner. I think he has a little bit more open field speed, but Elliott, I don't know why Ohio State just doesn't give him the ball until he can't run anymore. Cardale Jones has obviously struggled this year at quarterback, which is a nice way of saying it. But, Ezekiel Elliott, it just seems like every time he gets the ball, there's a chance that he can take it for a touchdown. He runs with a lot of great power, good footwork. He's a very good just one cut and go kind of player. He's very good. He doesn't really get used a ton in the passing game, and obviously his pass blocking, like a lot of college running backs, especially in their junior and sophomore years, he's not a great pass blocker, but he's just so good getting through the hole, bursting through the line, very much in between the tackles kind of runner. So I think he's legit. I think he's worthy of a first-round pick if he comes out. But I do think Ohio State would be smart to get him the ball. I mean, he had touchdown runs this past week of 55, 65, and 75 yards.
Wow.
And that's just incredible. So he's a very, very talented player.
Rob, we talk a lot about philosophy as well of the draft and, running backs particular falling out. This past 3 years we've had 2 first-round running backs, both last year with Todd Gurley and Melvin Gordon. You and your top 26 here don't have a running back. Obviously, I think you see Ezekiel Elliott as the top guy. What do you think he's going to need to do to get in the first round?
I don't think there's a great deal that he can do to go particularly early, because I think Dan's hit the nail on the head. He's not Todd Gurley, and the Seahawks, if you believe reports, had Todd Gurley as the best player in the draft this year. I bet they weren't alone. He went 10th, and that's with a significant knee injury. Just imagine where he would have gone if he was healthy. I mean, he could easily have been a top 5 pick. He could have ended up as well like the Jets, something like that, if not earlier. So he was a special, special guy. I think that Elliott's not quite as special as that, and I put him very much in. Maybe Dan's got an opinion on this guy. I mean, I saw Alex Collins again this weekend, and I just don't understand why he doesn't get a lot more attention. I was watching him against Tennessee. The guy cuts better than anybody else in college football right now, and that's including the top guy, which is Leonard Fournette. I mean, if you want a guy who can cut, use vision to find a hole, and then just explode, who can start and stop really quickly, and break off big gains. Alex Collins at Arkansas is just a tremendous player, and I think that he and Elliott are going to end up going in similar places. I like Elliott. He's kind of good at everything, but it isn't quite that generational player that we always talk about, like a Gurley could be or a Fournette is going to be. And I think with Collins, the thing I really like about Collins, and we see it again this weekend against the Vols, just runs with a real authority and a real aggressiveness. And we hear Pete Carroll talk about what they want in a running back, and Thomas Rawls and what he's going to show and what we're going to see from him as he spells for Marshawn Lynch. And we saw against Chicago is that he's just got a real attitude, but he hits the hole really well, drives, breaks the first tackle and gets it, balls forward. You see it with Collins, you see it from time to time with Elliott, and I'll tell you who you don't see it with, and that's Derrick Henry at Alabama, who just, for me, even though Alabama played very well against Georgia, thought this weekend looked pretty soft with the way that he runs, despite the fact he's an absolute beast in terms of size. So, I think that Collins and Elliott are going to go in a similar range, and for me, that probably should be at the front end of round 2.
Yeah, speaking of Todd Gurley as well, and a guy that we haven't talked about, I think, yet on 6 episodes, probably because he's not eligible for the 2016 draft, it's kind of unbelievable to think that, in a few years we could be talking about how Todd Gurley and Nick Chubb were teammates in the same backfield. Do you see where do you think the 2017 draft, Dan, is going to go in terms of, I know it's early yet, but when you're talking about Fournette and Chubb, where do you see these 2 types of guys going? Is it going to be a situation like we had back in 2003, I think, or 4, with Cadillac Williams and Cedric Benson and one other guy?
Yeah, I think it could be just like that, and I think it's going to be warranted. I mean, I know the argument is out there that you just don't need to take a running back high in the draft, and so many teams run with 2 running backs, in their system. But talent is talent, and both of those guys have a lot of it. And same with Dalvin Cook from Florida State. I think he's right in there with those 2 guys as 2017 players. And I try not to pay too much attention to the guys that aren't draft eligible, but particularly with Fournette, you just can't help it. Just be blown away by what they can do. So I think 2017 is going to be very good. Back to your point on Alex Collins, I don't think he gets a lot of attention, partly because I think playing at Arkansas, you kind of expect the running back to be really good in that system with the offensive line. So I think he gets overshadowed because of that. And he split time with Jonathan Williams there in the past, and so I don't think he got to always be the spotlight guy there. So I do like Alex Collins quite a bit, but 2017, boy, That's already shaping up as the year of the running back. There's like 5 or 6 of them actually. The other 3 guys are skipping my brain right now, but it's a very, very good group.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time. I've been pounding home the idea that you can't take running backs in the first round. I don't think I have to stick with it and say that I don't think the Rams made the right pick, even if Gurley rushes for 1,500 yards, because we've seen a lot of running backs rush for 1,500 yards, and it's sort of like the quarterback that leads the league in passing yards. It doesn't mean that that's a good team. Usually, it's not a good team. I realize that running backs, when you run for more yards, usually means you're leading. But I could point to a bunch of guys that were great draft picks, like Adrian Peterson, that just haven't won their team games. So that's the thing that I've sort of stuck with. And I think a lot of the talent of high school kids and even middle school kids is being drawn towards not playing running back because their parents and their coaches are saying, you're going to get hurt, you're not going to get paid. I mean, you could look at DeMarco Murray and say that's the highest paid running back, and he didn't get nearly as much as Byron Maxwell. So I would say that it's not the place that I would be sending my talent, and at the same time, that makes a guy like Leonard Fournette that much special because he's so much better than everyone else in the NCAA, it seems like, and is obviously going to be the guy that is pushing the boundaries as far as when a player should be able to play in the NFL. I think he seems to be 10 times better than Maurice Clarett coming out of college. I would say the talk this week is about whether or not Leonard Fournette should sit in 2016, protect himself, come out for the draft, and probably still be a top 3 pick in 2017. Rob, do you think that that's a good idea?
I think it's an idea. It's something that he probably should consider, but won't consider because Leonard Fournette is just. I mean, LSU means too much to Leonard Fournette for him to just go and sit on his backside and watch his teammates go out there. We've talked about the number 18 jersey at LSU and what that means, and it wouldn't surprise me if he was a candidate to wear that next year. His teammates respect him. He's a beast. He seems to love running the ball for that team. I mean, there was no let up. You could probably I saw a bit. I was watching college football's red zone, goal line, or whatever it's called. And LSU Eastern Michigan was the time that it kicked off it made it a bit of a feature for a time, and I watched a bit of Leonard Fournette running in that game, and I thought we'll find out today in a game that LSU are going to win, with their arms tied behind their back, how hard he's going to run the ball and how much this type of game means to him, knowing that he will know full well that he's going to be a very, very early pick in the draft. And the guy runs for his 3rd straight 200-yard game, runs as hard as ever. Just looked pissed off to me. Have a really good game, as usual. And I think there is no way you try and stop Leonard Fournette running next year every single week for LSU. I don't think he's going to have any of that. I just think the guy is phenomenal. They've got the perfect package of attitude, running style, physical qualities, and everything you say, Kenny, about taking running backs early is completely. It's watertight. You would have a hard time disagreeing with it. But I've got a suspicion that a team is going to, unless there's a whole host of quarterbacks that emerge, I think a team's going to look at Leonard Fournette and say, we can win with this guy, and we need this guy. And maybe if they've already got a young quarterback, hey, we'll just throw him in there. And he could go for me. We've talked about it before. It's very, very early, but it wouldn't be a total shocker if he went in the top 3 picks in 2017. He's that good.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, and I can't disagree with the fact, obviously, as a Seahawks fan, they didn't draft Marshawn Lynch, but they wouldn't be the team they are without Marshawn Lynch. I just think, but that's the whole point to me is that a lot of these teams find these guys in ways roundabout that they don't have to use their top pick. That being said, if it was a team like Cleveland, for example, sitting there at number 3 in 2017, and on a transcendent talent like Fournette sits there, I'm sure that they would probably really highly consider taking him and just sort of hopefully forget that Trent Richardson ever existed, perhaps. And do you have any other thoughts there on Fournette, Dan?
Well, thank you for the low blow of Trent Richardson. But
Trent Richardson is a low blow all into himself.
Yeah. As to the question of should he sit out next season, I hope not, just because I'm a college football fan first and foremost. So from a very greedy standpoint, I hope he does not sit out next year. And like Rob was saying, I don't think he will. That was the same thing that came up with Jadeveon Clowney at South Carolina. And at the end of the day, he basically just said, I can't quit on my teammates, basically. And that's kind of what it would do if he sat out. I mean, obviously, I know there's a great risk there, but, I think if you see Todd Gurley get taken in the top 10 after tearing his ACL, I think you have to feel pretty good about it. And it's going to be interesting to watch Fournette really get picked apart, next year and the unfair in-season draft process goes. I already see people criticize him because a lot of his runs come on pitch plays, and he doesn't really run between the tackles, and he doesn't follow blocks, and he's just an animal out there. So, it'll be infuriating listening to the draft media pick him apart next year. So I'm going to enjoy him as we have him here in college football.
Let's do a few quick hits, and then we can move on to mock drafts or something else perhaps. But I just want to go over some of these guys that played this weekend and maybe get your guys' thoughts, and we'll just try and keep it concise. Trevone Boykin of TCU, the number 3 in the country. He's playing well. Is he a draft prospect, Dan?
I think so, only because the state of the quarterback is so poor in the NFL that he does enough that you would use some kind of pick on him. I'm not saying you would use a first-round pick on him, but I think there's enough developmental talent there where you take him. I don't think his throwing motion is that bad. He's obviously athletic. I know Josh Doxson and Colby Listenby help his cause quite a bit there at TCU, but I just think he's talented enough where you would take a chance on him at some point.
Rob, do you have a thought there as well on Boykin?
I think that he might get drafted. I've spent a bit of time watching him. I think he's more likely to be an undrafted free agent who gets a camp, at best maybe a late round pick. Because he's one of those guys who looks great in college, but I don't ever see him starting in the NFL. And I have this kind of theory with quarterbacks is that if they have almost no shot to start in the NFL, why is an NFL team going to take him?
Yeah, it's interesting, just for some reason right there, maybe it's because of the color purple. I was thinking of Colin Klein, the former K-State quarterback who was right there in the top of the Heisman, but I'm not exactly sure what he's doing now. Perhaps selling cars or something, which is fine. It's a fine profession. Maybe he's playing football. But, yeah, it's interesting that divide between college and the NFL, especially at the quarterback position. What about just because TCU beat Texas 50-7, a lot of fans might be curious what the hell that's about. Is Texas have any talent at all, Dan?
Draft eligible talent, not really. I mean, they have a cornerback, Duke Thomas, I think is his name. Sorry if that's wrong. Texas is so bad I can never remember their players anymore. But
it's always Duke something.
Right. They have a cornerback who's like a dime cornerback, 7th round pick type of player, and they have a defensive tackle whose name is also eluding my memory right now. Sorry, but he's a pretty okay player. Nothing too great though. I mean, if Texas doesn't get a player drafted next year, I wouldn't be completely shocked.
Yeah. Michigan State beat Purdue, but just by 3. Connor Cook goes 13 of 19, 139 yards, and a touchdown. Rob has been pretty adamant that Connor Cook is not a great NFL draft prospect at quarterback. He has been sticking around in a lot of mock drafts somewhere in the first round. I see that you have him at 14, which is pretty normal for a lot of people to be having him up there. But do you feel good about that, or do you think that he could be sliding like Rob does?
Well, I just think it's more of a symptom of so many teams look like they need quarterbacks, and he gets compared to Andy Dalton. I think that's a pretty fair comparison on the good end and the bad end of the spectrum. I think the Andy Dalton buzz at the start of this NFL season is going to die away here as the season goes on. But he he's solid. You know, he's not going to get you killed. He's not going to blow you away with anything. He's just an okay quarterback, and because of that, he gets, you know, his status, I think, gets elevated, especially in a year where there just isn't that many good quarterbacks in the draft, or it certainly doesn't look like it early on. So he's elevated based on his position.
If you were the GM of the Browns, would you trade a first-round pick for Andy Dalton?
Oh,
boy.
That is a belting question.
And it's not one that I haven't been asked before, to be honest with you. I probably would, just from the standpoint of getting you 8, 9, and 10 wins every year, which Andy Dalton seems to be capable of doing, is pretty good for a team like the Browns. And I think there are a handful of other NFL teams that would gladly have someone like Andy Dalton, despite his postseason woes.
Yeah, I said Andy Dalton. This is something I found out last night during my research. Only the third quarterback in NFL history to post a passer rating of at least 115 in each of his team's first 4 games. So he's up there. It's a wild thing to watch. You know, I think A.J. Green is a part of that. But, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how he goes. Rob, Clemson upset Notre Dame this week. They move up into the top 10. Notre Dame falls down in an exciting game. Who's the best player on Clemson, and what do you expect from them the rest of the year?
Their best player, sadly, is Pittsburgh, a rather serious injury in that it was a neck injury. Williams and like the great thing about Clemson, and it's, I think, to Darbo Sweeney's credit, is that they keep losing sort of big name players to the NFL, and yet they seem to maintain. They don't ever seem to fall off the map, and they're always competitive in the ACC. They always seem to get to a good bowl game. But their best player is another Mike Williams. I mean, like just like the NFL needs another receiver named Mike Williams coming into the league. But he hurt himself sadly in the first game, and it looked quite kind of serious. So let's hope that he makes a full recovery. And he, for me, is their best player. They have a Curse, who is Jaron Curse, who is a safety as well, who's maybe one to keep an eye on. But they don't have sort of the top end elite sort of players. You know, there's not a Sammy Watkins there who, or even a Martavis Bryant who is going to sort of tickle the first round at all.
Dan, this week Michigan beat Maryland 28-0, so they're on another incredible run right now, defense and all that kind of stuff. Even though Jim Harbaugh took over a team that wasn't considered to be very talented, obviously now they're going to be going to a bowl, maybe even going to a really good bowl game. It would seem that way at least. Has Harbaugh? I mean, he's working with what he's got, but has he actually helped turn any of these guys into good draft prospects?
Not that I can tell. I mean, Jake Butt, the tight end, is probably the best draft-eligible prospect they have. They have some good underclassmen. You know, Jabril Peppers is potentially a very good player, but you know, from a draft-eligible standpoint, there's not much going on there. Their running back is pretty solid, but nothing you would use a top 100 pick on. Yeah, to me it's a lot of Jim Harbaugh magic. He's a very good coach, and I think he's going to have Michigan really, making the Big Ten even more relevant over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I think as a Seahawks fan, we're not upset to see Jim Harbaugh take his Harbaugh magic away from San Francisco and over there to Michigan. Let's move on then to these mock drafts, because I'd like to get into some of these. We haven't really, even though this is a podcast called 3000 NFL Mock Draft, we haven't had a full, real mock draft. We've had Rob's top 20, and we're just trying to formulate these now, and you got yours dropping out this week, Dan. Talk to me a little bit, because you said that you've done the last one that you did previous to this was before the season. We've had 5 games. You're doing this one. What was the biggest change or biggest surprise to you as you did this one?
That's a good question. Probably Jared Goff, just because quite frankly, I don't remember much of the last one because it came out in May. And to me, I don't know if Rob agrees with this or not, but to me, this is the hardest time of the year to do these, and agonizing over a mock draft is ridiculous, but um, to me, this is the hardest time of the year because you're making judgments on NFL players after a few games. You're making judgments on finally draft eligible players after a few games. So it's more of an exercise to kind of get you back into the rhythm of it, for me at least, of doing these and kind of figuring out team needs, who's going to be free agents after this year, what college players have really fallen off. So, I have Jared Goff going number one. I don't think he's a classic, amazing franchise quarterback, but he's the best quarterback. So he's up there. Cardale Jones completely fell off the map, so he's out of there totally. So yeah, you start with the quarterbacks and you start working your way down, I guess.
So would you say it's sort of Jared Goff is like a Blake Bortles type player in terms of his draft prospects?
I don't know. I can't get on board with the Bortles thing just because they're from at least a body type standpoint, they're so different. But to me, Jared Goff is a lot closer to Teddy Bridgewater than anything else. He doesn't have that amazing arm. He's a good enough athlete, kind of slight of build to a degree. He's not 6'5". I think he's more in the 6'2" range. But he does the stuff pre-snap, goes through his progressions decently. I mean, the offense he's in doesn't always call for it. But, I just think that he's looked better this year than he has in the past, and he's gotten a little bigger, and he has enough arm strength. So, and he's a quarterback. And I just think that rules all, especially when, for me at least, I had the Bears picking number one. So that was the choice I went with.
And fair choice. As far as the Bears picking one, we'll see about Jared Goff as the season goes on. But Rob, did you want to address what Dan had said about the hardest time of year to do these things?
Yeah, it absolutely is, and it's a lot easier in just a few weeks' time. You'll have two things. One, you'll have a lot more games, and you'll have a feel for certain players. And the other thing is that you will start to hear little bits from the media, so you will get an idea of who the league really likes, who the league is not quite as high on, and all these little things. Let's not kid around that it's just a pure. I've watched 300 players and I know who's the best 32. You can rely on a bit of information here or there to try and, you might, maybe a name gets thrown out. This guy's, maybe Adam Schefter will say this guy's destined for the first round, and you'll go and watch him, and it's maybe someone you've not heard of before or you've not spent much time on. You go and watch him, and then you'll see in a few weeks' time he'll suddenly be in everybody's mock draft. So it's the information combined with, watching games and following college football closely. In a couple of months' time, it's a lot easier to do these types of things. And even I try and, I have the luxury maybe that Dan doesn't, in that because it's an independent blog at Seahawks Draft Blog, there's nobody there saying you must get a mock draft out there. They'll get you lots of hits and lots of attention. So I can kind of delay doing them as late as possible. But I'm as like everybody else. If you like college football and you like the NFL draft, you can't help but like every week just go and see who's doing a mock draft and having a little scan through and seeing where certain guys are going, and it's just pure entertainment. And it's and on Jared Goff, I'm right with Dan there. He's not a guy that I expected to be putting very early in the first round, but out of all of the names, out of all of the quarterbacks who are eligible for this class, he's the one who has shown the most so far. And as long as he can keep winning the games he should win at California and not turning it over too much and making something. I mean, there was a fantastic. We said this last week, Kenny, in the Washington game, not the Washington State one. In the Washington game, his first touchdown against Washington was fantastic. Eye of the needle stuff with very little backlift. So he's got a bit of talent there, and teams like Chicago are going to be looking for a quarterback. So I think there's a very good chance that he goes early.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of Cal first-round picks at quarterback, and he's got better numbers, at least, than all of them for the most part. But we'll see. The other interesting thing, it's not so much that Jared Goff displaced him at number one, but in your mock draft, Dan, it's the fact that Joey Bosa has fallen all the way to number 4. A lot of people have him as number 1. Can you sort of explain where your head was at in terms of dropping Bosa to 4? And do you think that he's sliding per se?
Yeah, no, I don't think he's sliding at all. it's just more than anything, it was the draft order that I used. So the Bears were number one, and I think quarterback is such a need there. That makes sense. Jacksonville is number two. I think they have some good pieces on defense, and they just need an offensive tackle so bad. So that was the direction I went there. And the Browns, they've spent a lot of money and assets on the defense, and they just need offense so badly that I couldn't go Bosa with the top 3 picks. I think Bosa is the best player in the draft, but I think we've seen before sometimes the best player doesn't go first overall or in the top 3 even. So that's just why that played out the way it did.
Fair enough. I wrote this morning about the 49ers and what I thought they were going to do. I think that they are so terrible that I do expect them to be in the top 3, if not, or top 5, maybe top 3. I actually was thinking offensive tackle because they lost Anthony Davis. Joe Staley is very old. I think he's very old. But so I was going with tackle. What would you say for the Seahawks fans out there? What are their needs in your opinion, and how do they fall in line?
Oh boy, you guys would know the Seahawks needs better than me, but
49ers.
The 49ers. I'm sorry. I heard Seahawks in there, and I'm seeing a Seahawks logo, so it's on the brain. 49ers. I think they probably expect Davis to be back next year. And obviously you can't trust a guy who surprise retired on you, but I think he'll be back next year. So Ronnie Stanley was off the board when I got to the 49ers pick, so it became a thing where do you go with the best player in the draft or do you go with Laramie Tunsil from Ole Miss, who, unless I'm mistaken, hasn't played this season. So and he had a bad injury last year. You talked about Laquan Treadwell coming back from injury for them and a little slow to start the season. And I think Tunsil might be similar. He had a bad injury in the ball, I believe. So, yeah, it just came down to Joey Bosa is the best player in the draft. I think the 49ers need help on the defensive line, and Tunsil is a little bit of an unknown at this point. So that was the reasoning.
Rob, a lot of bases for me to send to you to cover. First of all, Joey Bosa, do you think that his talent transcends team need?
Well, before we get on to Joey Bosa, Joe Staley is exactly the same age as me. In fact, he's actually a couple of months younger. So
well, you're old as shit, Rob.
I'm actually my surprise to find out I'm really, really old tonight. But no, on Joey Bosa, I think that we compared him. We tried to compare him to people, and is often the way with the NFL draft. And I think there's a bit of Chris Long in there. I think he's probably a little sharper and may test better than Long did. He's kind of got a similar sparky attitude as well. So I think that there's every chance that he's going to go. I mean, for me, I think there's unless someone like Jared Goff really sort of wows everybody in the postseason to go in the first 2 picks, I think there's every chance that we're going to see Bosa and Nkemdiche go very early. Nkemdiche not based on production but based on upside, and he will blow up the combine probably. And I think that linemen, and then again it's a theme we've talked about, Kenny. Linemen are going to probably dominate early on in this draft. So if it's not offensive linemen, it's going to be the defensive guys, and I think Bosa and Nkemdiche will be in a year where there isn't sort of the real big name quarterbacks and receivers and such. I think that there's every chance that those two will step forward. Tunsil hasn't played and probably isn't going to play this year for Ole Miss because of the NCAA violations. So he's going to be a bit of a wild card there, but a very, very talented player who I could easily see going early. And then it's a bit of a, kind of throw it up in the air right now. I mean, there are a number of guys who could get into the mix. It's wide open. But I think that Bosa has picked a good year to, well, he's not picked the year, but it's a good year for him to come out, because I think that teams will weigh up their options. And similar to when Clowney went first overall, Houston will have said, we probably, in another world, we would have taken a quarterback here, but there isn't one, so what else is out there? Clowney, okay, production not great, athleticism amazing, we're going to go that way. And I think teams will have a very similar approach to Bosa, but his pick will be more based on production rather than just the insane upside that Clowney had, because they're very different players.
Yeah, I still think the Texans are wondering whether or not they should have taken a quarterback anyway. I also, I'm not here to bang your guys' heads up against each other. That's just joking. But at the same time, it is important, and nobody is wrong or right, especially at this stage. But it is important to ask why certain evaluations can be so different. So Dan has Ronnie Stanley at number 2. I don't see Ronnie Stanley in your top 26, Rob. So can you sort of tell your opinion on Ronnie Stanley?
I don't like him. I'm not a fan at all. And when I watch him play, I just see so many fundamental errors. I don't think he can play left tackle at the next level. I thought the game against Clemson highlighted real issues again with Stanley's game. And I think coming into the year, I was thinking, well, he made the right decision to come back and play another season in Notre Dame. And I don't think he's making any progress. And there are just so many other offensive tackles that I prefer in this class. We talked about Tunsil there. Jack Conklin, Michigan State, I think is a better player. Taylor Decker, I think is a better player. Sean Coleman is a better player. Ifedi at Texas A&M is a better player. And I just think that Stanley's going to... I know that he is one of the poster childs of a lot of mock drafts for 2016 so far, but I think he's going to fall a little bit when we get through this thing. I think teams are going to push him down their board a little bit, and he might be one of the bigger names who slumps. He's certainly not technically as good as Zach Martin was, and Martin played left tackle, and you always projected to move inside. I'm not as confident that he can even move inside and be a functioning offensive lineman. I've got real issues with him.
Dan, on that note, we've talked a little bit about corner and that he wasn't high on Vernon Hargreaves, but he did mention Tre'Davious White, the number 18 jersey, LSU cornerback, team leader, all that good stuff. Do you have any thoughts about Tre'Davious White, and do you think that he could be rising up, or is that someone that you don't really have on your radar for the first round?
I think he's slightly on the radar. I mean, in the back half of the first round, I was putting together a bunch of teams needed cornerbacks. Like I got to the Steelers, for instance, and you wondered is that where he comes off the board at? But I don't really see him show up that much, and I think he's more of an athlete than a really good defensive back right now. So. You mentioned fundamental issues with Ronnie Stanley. I think Tre'Davious White has them for a cornerback as well. So, but LSU has turned into a defensive back factory, and he's obviously the next guy coming out of there. But I think he's right on the fringe of that first round territory. I mean, I just like Hargreaves a lot better, and I understand some of the concern about Hargreaves, and especially if he measures in short at the combine, I think that's where you're going to see him drop. But I just like guys like Kendall Fuller a lot more. I like the Cameron Sutton from Tennessee a fair bit more. So after those three, Fuller, Hargreaves, and Sutton, I'm having a hard time getting completely on board right now with the first round talk. But like I said, that's the real true joy of doing this kind of thing in October, where I might not be buying into Tre'Davious White right now, but I might be in a month. So it's the process, I guess.
Yeah, and another guy that we've talked about a lot that I've come to really like, that I would hope doesn't go this high, because the way that Rob talks about him, I'd like him to fall. Either, I guess, maybe if he goes this high, then maybe the Seahawks will lose to the Lions tonight, and then they'll be able to draft him. But Michael Thomas, the wide receiver at Ohio State, Dan, what kind of a receiver would you compare him to at the next level?
Well, he's a complete wide receiver, so I'll get through some of the hyperbole before I come up with the comparison in my brain. But I just think he's a complete guy. He's like 6'3", 210. He can get up the field, goes after passes. He can work drag routes really well. I think he can get a little bit tighter in his footwork and that sort of thing, but I think he's a total package as far as wide receivers go. I think he's slightly behind Treadwell, but just barely. As far as the comparison goes, golly, he's kind of to me he's kind of like a little bit smaller Keyshawn Johnson type of wide receiver. I think a lot of scouts are going to compare him to Michael Floyd, who his career hasn't really done what you expected in Arizona, but
No.
similar kind of styles. Hopefully, Michael Thomas is more Keyshawn Johnson than Michael Floyd, but I like Michael Thomas quite a bit.
Yeah, I've been wanting every episode I want to get more and more into the NFL young guys, the rookies, and these guys like to try and figure it out, but we always just run out of time. One of these days, though, because Michael Floyd, how fascinating is it that he seemed to be going on the right track and had those good numbers, and now he barely gets on the field. Moving on, Rob, some of these guys that I'm seeing now on Dan's mock draft, I don't think we even talked about or maybe hit on quickly, so maybe you could give your thoughts. At number 21, he has the Buffalo Bills taking Spencer Drango, offensive tackle at Baylor. What are your thoughts on Drango?
Yeah, Drango was on my watch list. I've not seen Baylor play this year. They've not, surprisingly, over the years we've had so many Baylor games on TV over here in the UK. Not seen them yet, so I will reserve judgment on him. But he was certainly a guy with some first round potential there, and I've had more of a chance to look at Michigan State and confirm what I was thinking about Jack Conklin, for example, than Ohio State, that are the new Alabama over here, so they're on nearly all the time. And Texas A&M are a very popular pick as well, so I've had a chance to look at a Fady a bit more. So a guy that I hope to get onto later in the year.
Cool, and I think we should just fast forward here to the end. It's been a little bit over an hour, but we will take the last segment here, which is Dan has given us the privilege and the honor of being able to look at the Seahawks without a pick in your mock draft, and we know who is off the board. Going just quickly, a couple of the guys before, you have the Seahawks at 30th. These are, again, based off Super Bowl odds. Panthers, Tyler Boyd out of Pittsburgh. The Eagles taking DeForest Buckner out of Oregon. That would make some sense. The Vikings taking Sean Oakman out of Baylor. The Falcons, Ashawn Robinson out of Alabama. All guys that, Rob has mentioned in his first round. The Colts, Darren Lee. The Bengals, Andrew Billings. The Cardinals, Adolphus Washington. And the Broncos, Jermaine Ifedi. So why don't we start with Dan? What are your thoughts here as you head into filling in this pick for the Seahawks as far as what they need and who's the best available player on your board?
My best available player, I think, at this point would be Joshua Perry, the linebacker from Ohio State. But I don't think that's a way that the Seahawks would go in the first round. Shalik Calhoun is still out there for Michigan State. I think that's a possibility. I'm kind of leaning toward wide receiver a little bit. I think Jermaine Kearse is going to be gone after this year. I think he was the guy who was the free agent for the Seahawks. Sorry if I'm wrong. Seahawks.
He is.
Mafia, but I think I'm leaning wide receiver, so it comes down to someone like Rashard Higgins from Colorado State and Josh Doxson from TCU, and I think I'm leaning a little more toward Doxson, but I really want to see what you guys think here.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great opportunity, Rob. I think, you've got your guys that would be right there at the top of your big board, Tre'Davious White, for example, being available. But given the way that you've seen how Dan's draft plays out, what are your thoughts here for the Seahawks at 30?
Well, Kenny, I think that Tre'Davious White is a beautiful human being. So, I do think on White that teams are just going to fall in love with the guy. The jersey number 18, in fact, mixed him with his playing athleticism. He's got a great kick return against Syracuse. So it's hard for me to kind of look beyond that, but maybe it's a little bit predictable to just go down there. I think that Taylor Decker's still available. based on the board, and I think that Seattle's main focus is going to be the offensive line for two reasons. One, Russell Okung is a free agent. The cap situation in Seattle, they may just feel like paying Okung a lot of money to continue to be the starter may just be a little pricey for them. I think Okung himself, Danny O'Neill has speculated on this on ESPN 710 that he suspects that Okung would like to go to a passing style offense that maybe puts less pressure on his body so he can stay healthy, and then maybe he will go to a pass-heavy team instead of a run-heavy team like Seattle. So if they're having to fill a hole there, Seattle's offensive line isn't very good anyway. If they're going to lose their one good, solid pro on that offensive line, then replacing him is going to have to be the priority. And even if they keep Okung, I think that the Seahawks could just stand for getting the best available offensive lineman. So, Ideca's there, and I really, really like Sean Coleman at Auburn, who is a guy who can play inside and out. I think the first game of the season for Auburn, he showed that he's got a great kick slide. He knocked a couple of guys on the backside, which I always like to see. And loves to get to the second level as well. And I think he could be a really good zone blocking guy. So obviously the health issues, he's had cancer and he's come back from that. I think that they would obviously be looked into. But if he gets the all clear, then I would love nothing more than to see someone like Sean Coleman playing for the Seahawks.
Yeah, and my thoughts is even going against my own very base philosophy, the Seahawks will have to draft someone to take the reins from Marshawn Lynch. I think they tipped their hands a little bit with Kristen Michael, which is that they like me believe that you can get a great all-pro running back at the end of the second round. It didn't work out for Kristen Michael. As far as I know, he's only made 2 Pro Bowls. He hasn't made the All-Pro list yet. But it may not work out for Kristen Michael. I don't think Thomas Rawls is going to be the long-term answer. I could be wrong. Other guys, undrafted free agents, Arian Foster, it's happened before. A lot of these guys, it seems like, they do one thing really well and you can play them, but as far as, taking over the full-time duties. So I wonder if they would go with a running back. Alex Collins is a guy that you really like. So there's something there. But then also, I do think as well, offensive line is something that they're going to have to address. Bruce Irvin's position on the defense is something that they may probably have to address. I don't know necessarily that they would take a corner. I think Kerry Williams has played really well. He's signed for 3 years. Richard Sherman is signed. Would they might possibly look if there was a size athletically gifted type player that looked somewhat like Cam Chancellor? Would they take him? And knowing that Cam Chancellor was going to be a contract issue next season, which he's already said that he will be. So I would definitely be thinking there. And yeah, of course, wide receiver is something that I almost don't even trust them to do anything at wide receiver because they've been they seem so poor at identifying which players seem to fit in their system and then reaching in terms of how much they either pay them on the free agent market or where they draft them. Though it does seem like they may have gotten that right with Tyler Lockett. That's so far working out a lot more in the return game than it is the receiving game. So I think I guess my final answer is I agree with both of you guys on all your points. I just want you guys to like me, and I want the listeners.
There's no danger there, Kenny.
But yeah, that's good. I like, and we could even finish it up, because you have the Patriots. Their pick is forfeited. I love it. And then the Packers. It's an interesting question as well to ask. What do you think? What just in the final question, I guess, Dan. What do you think the Packers, with the philosophy that of Ted Thompson and all that kind of stuff? What would you assume that they do here?
Yeah, well, to go back on the Seahawks thing really, really quickly.
Yeah.
I like Taylor Decker so much. He was gone and in the top 10. So
I just misread. I apologize.
He was off the board there, unfortunately. But the Packers, you just keep wondering what's on defense. Are they going to take a high inside linebacker at some point? They've got some free agents. Mike Neal's a free agent, so they're going to try and replace him. They've needed a nose tackle for a while. B.J. Raji's a free agent. LaTroy Guion's a free agent, stuff like that. So I think the Packers, it's going to be defense. I have literally not actually completed the mock draft. Like I stopped at the Seahawks pick, but it's probably going to be a defensive player for Green Bay.
What do you think, Rob? Because it is the team that the Seahawks may have to compete with for the next 5 years.
Yeah, it's kind of sacrilege to criticize Ted Thompson. I've just not been impressed with their drafts for a while now. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of their draft last year. I didn't like Nick Perry, the pick. Obviously, who's the guy at UCLA?
Datone Jones.
Datone Jones has flopped to the point when there was a danger of him being cut before they kept him on. And they've done well to put together an offensive line that protects well. But they've got Aaron Rodgers, and they could pretty much draft one of those guys next year in the first round while he's still there. And the guy's a genius. And it's funny how when you have a guy like that things just seem to tick. So, yeah. Before we go, Kenny, can I just make one general NFL observation?
Yeah, just as long as it's only one, and in that it's something I agree with, sure.
I think you'll like it.
Okay.
So, in the UK, obviously I cover soccer for a living. What they will do after the game is they will shuffle you into a room, and they will bring the head coach for a one-on-one interview, and then if the team has won, potentially a player. If the team has lost, you may not get the chance to speak to one of the players. And I was at Wembley yesterday for the Jets-Dolphins game, and it amazes me how different it is in America and with American sports. So I've gone into the locker room with my colleague, and there is just the whole of the Jets team there. No modesty in the slightest. I mean, there is just cock everywhere, and you could just go up to these guys and speak to them. And I interviewed Breno Giacomini. James Carpenter was naked, stood right next to him while I was doing the interview, which was rather off-putting. As Seahawks fans, you could get a good mental image there. And I just cannot believe how different the two approaches to the media are. And I just think the NFL should be praised for the willingness to let the media just speak to their guys and without supervision. And I hope that stays that way for an awful long time. I think that Sean Payton has been almost trying to sort of lead a revolution here by not doing a press conference before each game. But don't let him win because I thoroughly enjoyed the post-game locker room scene last night. Maybe they could have won a few more towels or could have got changed before I came down, but that aside, it was good.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should rename this podcast to Cock Everywhere, and then that'll be something. I think that Marshawn Lynch may disagree with you, and you would disagree with Marshawn Lynch as far as player interactions. I could say that I went into the Seahawks locker room before a couple times after games, and there are players that you would think, like offensive linemen, let's say the right side of the Seahawks offensive line, without naming names, would go up to him and go, hey, can I ask you a few questions? And they would say no, and I'm like, really? It's not like you're not the guys. There's not a crowd here. Is that a problem to get a few answers back and forth? So you would be surprised perhaps with some of the guys that shut you down. But at the same time, I have no idea what it's like to cover soccer or football, as it were, English football as I call it. So I don't know if that's like, but yeah, it sounds awful. And I did get a lot of interviews. I never went to a Jets game, but I did go to a Dolphins game. And I was kind of waiting around for Cameron Wake, who waited about 45 minutes and then gave 2 minutes. But it's I didn't think about it that way. But that is nice to hear that the UK had a good experience with their football this week.
Yeah, the only downside was the fact we had to watch the Miami Dolphins play. But that aside, it was a good experience.
Imagine how Miami feels. So, Dan, thank you again for coming on to the podcast for well over an hour and giving us your time and thoughts and the very first peek into your mock draft that's coming out this week. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Mocking the Draft. Links to all my stuff will end up on there at some point. So just do that. And if I can give one piece of advice, when you go into a locker room, eyes up.
Speak for yourself. So thanks for coming on, and everybody, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Subscribe to 3000 NFL Mock Draft on iTunes, and we will be coming back next week with something else that's also around the area of the NFL and the NCAA and drafts. So thank you very much.